Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. Ethan's breathing slowed as he pressed himself against the door of his bedroom. His mind raced, searching for logic in what he'd just experienced. The voice, melodic yet otherworldly, still echoed faintly in his ears. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just exhaustion, a mind overstimulated by stress and lack of sleep. But the silence in the house was oppressive now, almost as if it were listening. He turned toward the window, needing the comfort of the night sky to ground himself. The streetlights outside painted soft patterns against the walls. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw something or someone standing just beyond the pool of light. A shadow. Still watching, Ethan blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the thief, glass to confirm what he was seeing. The figure hadn't moved. It was the same shape, the same silhouette from his dreams. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. Was this another trick of his imagination, or had the nightmare spilled into reality? Hours passed, or so it felt. Ethan remained wide awake, pacing the room. He checked the time on his phone. 3:12 on floorboards. Every hum of the refrigerator, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed amplified. Unnerving. Determined to regain control, Ethan grabbed his phone and began searching for explanations. Recurring nightmares, he typed, hoping for something logical. The results were predictable stress, poor sleep hygiene, unresolved trauma. But none of that explained why the same figure from his dreams was now haunting his waking life. Another article caught his attention. It described sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations, common among overworked individuals. He nodded, trying to convince himself that was all it was. But no hallucination explained the strange symbols he'd found etched faintly into his bedroom wall earlier that day. His phone buzzed unexpectedly, jolting him. A message flashed across the screen from an unknown number. Have you seen it yet? His stomach dropped. He stared at the screen, the words swimming in his vision. The phone buzzed again. This time, an image appeared, a blurry photo of his bedroom window. His bedroom window. The angle was wrong. This photo wasn't taken from Ransieri. What you do was wrong. This photo wasn't taken from inside the house. It was taken from outside, looking in. Ethan bolted to the window, his heart hammering. The street outside was empty, bathed in the faint orange glow of the streetlights. There was no movement, no sign of anyone lurking nearby. Yet the picture on his phone was clear. Someone had been there, watching him. He shut the blinds quickly, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the cord. His thoughts raced. Should he call the police? And tell them what? That he'd been dreaming of a shadowy figure, and now it seemed to be real. They'd laugh him off, or worse, suggest he seek help. He settled for locking every door and window in the house, triple-checking each one. The physical act of securing his space brought a brief sense of control, but it didn't last. When he returned to his room, the unease was still there, thicker than before. By 4:30 a.m., exhaustion began to creep in. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. The adrenaline that had fueled him all night was fading, leaving a gnawing fatigue in its place. He lay down reluctantly, telling himself it would be morning soon and that daylight would make all of this seem ridiculous. Sleep came reluctantly, pulling him into a restless haze. But the moment his eyes closed, the dream returned. He was back in the endless corridor, the air thick with the same suffocating silence. The shadowy figure stood at the end, closer than ever. This time, it didn't stay still. It moved, slowly, deliberately. The figure that moved began to advance. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. Ethan tried to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stopped inches from him. He could feel stopped inches from him. Its breath, cold and unnatural, against his face, and then it spoke, a single word, in that same melodic, alien language. Ethan woke with a start, gasping for air. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his face. The room was dark. As he wiped the sweat from his face, the room was dark, silent, but something felt wrong. His breath hitched as he realized the door to his bedroom, which he had locked, was now open. Ethan's chest tightened as his eyes locked onto the door. He was certain, absolutely certain, that he had locked it. Before lying down, the key was still in the lock, dangling slightly as if it had just been turned. He swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room. Nothing else seemed out of place, but the air felt heavier, colder, charged with an unnatural stillness. He grabbed his phone from the bedside table, its cold surface grounding him slightly. The screen was blank, no new messages, no strange images, but when he tapped the screen to check the time, something caught his eye. A faint reflection in the black mirror of the phone behind him. Standing just outside his bedroom door was the silhouette. Ethan spun around, the phone slipping from his hands and clattering onto the floor. The doorway was empty. He backed away, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. His body screamed at him to leave the house, to run, but his legs refused to move. He forced himself to step toward the door, inch by inch, peering into the dark hallway beyond. Nothing. Get a grip, he muttered under his breath, his voice shaky. You're imagining things? It's the lack of sleep. That's all, but deep down, he knew it wasn't true. The figure had been there. He'd seen it, felt it, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still somewhere close, watching. The rest of the night was a blur. Ethan didn't sleep again, nor did he venture far from the safety of his bedroom. The hours dragged on, each minute a battle against the gnawing fear that threatened to consume him. When the first light of dawn finally spilled through the blinds, it felt like a reprieve, a fragile shield against whatever had haunted him in the dark. Ethan left the house as soon as he could, his body running on adrenaline and caffeine. He needed answers, needed to understand what was happening to him. He began scouring the internet for anything that resembled his experience. Shadow figures, recurring dreams, symbols appearing in waking life. But most of what he found was pseudoscience or vague paranormal anecdotes, nothing concrete, nothing useful. Frustrated, he decided to take a different approach. The symbols he had seen both in the dream and on his wall had to mean something. He took a picture of the faint etchings and uploaded them to an image recognition site, hoping for a match. To his surprise, the site returned a result. The symbols weren't random. They were part of an ancient language, one that had been found carved into caves and ruins across various parts of the world. The language, referred to by scholars as Akaris, was thought to predate known civilizations. What little had been deciphered suggested it was used in rituals. Rituals meant to connect with something beyond human comprehension. Ethan stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Or had the symbols started to glow faintly again as he looked at the image on his phone? He rubbed his eyes, his exhaustion blurring the line between reality and hallucination. The soft chime of his phone startled him. It was another message from the unknown number. You're close. Don't stop now. His breath caught. He quickly typed back, his fingers trembling. Who are you? What do you want? The reply came instant. It's not about who I am. It's about who you are. Ethan sat frozen, the weight of those words pressing down on him. Who I am? He didn't understand. But before he could respond, a sound cut through the stillness of the house, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Coming from the window slowly, Ethan turned his head. The blinds were still drawn, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side knew he was there. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Ethan stood and approached the window. His heart felt like it might stop as he reached for the cord to pull the blinds aside. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, faintly, that melodic voice, the one from his dream, began to hum on the other side of the glass. Ethan yanked the blinds open, his fear turning to dread. The figure was standing there, inches from the window, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't flinch at the sudden motion. It just stood there, its presence suffocating, and then it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. A symbol, glowing faintly, appeared where its fingers touched. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him. The figure didn't move, but the hum grew louder, resonating in his skull, filling his mind with fragments of the same alien language. He clutched his head, his vision swimming, as the symbols from the dream began to swirl in his mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped when Ethan opened his eyes. The figure was gone, and the symbol on the glass had disappeared. But the weight in the air, the feeling that he was no longer alone, remained. Ethan stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, his back pressed against the far wall of his room. His breathing was pressed against the far wall of his room. His breathing was shallow, his heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. He stared at the window, half expecting the figure to reappear. But the glass remained clear, reflecting only the dim light of the morning. He wanted to believe it remained clear, reflecting only the dim light of the morning. That the figure wouldn't return, but deep down he knew better. This wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. Whatever it was, it had chosen him. Shaking, Ethan forced himself to his feet. He needed answers. If the symbols and the figure were connected to this ancient language, then someone out there had to know more. He scoured forums, academic articles, even conspiracy theory blogs, piecing together fragments of information that only left him more unsettled. They symbols, it seemed, were a form of summoning a call to something beyond the physical realm. But the language was incomplete, fragmented. No one had been able to fully translate it, and those who tried often claimed to experience strange phenomena, vivid dreams, unexplainable noises, and, in some cases, sightings of shadowy figures. Ethan's blood ran cold. The descriptions matched his own experiences almost perfectly. As the hours dragged on, Ethan's exhaustion began to take its toll. The lines between dream and reality blurred, the events of the past few nights replaying in his mind like a broken record. He felt trapped, as though the walls of his house were closing in on him. His thoughts, his phone, sitting on the desk, buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. It's almost time. Tonight, you'll understand. Ethan's hands shook as he read the words. His stomach churned. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, to delete the messages and pretend they didn't exist. But he couldn't. Whatever was happening, he had to face it. He had to know why this was happening to him. That night, the air in the house felt heavier, colder. Ethan sat heavier, colder, in his living room. Every light in the house turned on, as if the brightness could ward off whatever was coming. He had locked the doors and windows again, triple-checked every point of entry. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. Clock ticked past midnight. the familiar hum began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing, but it grew steadily louder, reverberating through the house until it felt like it was coming from inside his own head. Then came the tapping, slow, rhythmic. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at the front door. Ethan froze. His muscles tensed. His breath caught in his throat. The tapping continued, unrelenting, each knock sending a shiver down his spine. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he unlocked it. But there were no new messages, no calls, nothing to explain what was happening. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed again, stopped, his ears, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He waited, straining to hear any sound, any sign of movement, but the house was still, and then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and impenetrable. Thick and impenetrable. Ethan's breath quickened, panic setting in. He stumbled to his feet, his hands outstretched as he felt his way toward the nearest lamp. He flipped the switch, but nothing happened. His phone's flashlight barely cut through the oppressive blackness. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating through the walls, and with it came the voice, the same melodic, alien voice that had haunted his dreams. It was everywhere, surrounding him, filling the room with a language he couldn't understand but somehow felt was meant for him. Ethan turned in circles, the beam of his flashlight shaking as he scanned the empty room. His heart stopped when he saw it, the silhouette, standing in the corner. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "Double, what do you want?" Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward him. The air grew colder, the hum reaching a deafening pitch. Symbols began to appear on the walls, glowing faintly, their patterns shifting, aligning as though they were alive. Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest, a burning sensation that made him double over. He clutched at his shirt, gasping for air as the symbols burned brighter. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. When he looked up, the figure was inches away from him. It spoke. The words were unintelligible, but their meaning struck him like a thunderclap. It wasn't a question, nor a command. It was a statement, a declaration of emergency, something inevitable. Ethan's mind reeled as the symbols on the walls flared, their light filling the room. The figure reached out, its hand pressing against his chest. The burning sensation intensified, spreading through his body like fire. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, and then everything went black. When Ethan woke, he was lying on the floor of his living room. The lights were back on. The hum was gone, and the symbols had vanished. He sat up slowly, his body aching as though he'd been hit by a truck. His phone buzzed beside him, and he grabbed it with trembling hands. A new message. "You're ready now. It begins." Ethan stared at the screen, his mind racing. Ready for what? What had the figure done to him? He stood shakily, looking around the room for any sign of what had happened. But everything was as it had been before, normal, ordinary, except for one thing. On his chest, where the figure had touched him, a symbol was etched into his skin, faintly glowing. Ethan stared at the glowing symbol etched into his chest, its faint light pulsating in sync with his heartbeat. His fingers brushed against the mark, the skin warm to the touch, but it didn't hurt. The edges of the symbol seemed to shift subtly, as though it were alive. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. Panic set in. He stumbled to the bathroom, flipping on the light and tearing his shirt off to examine himself in the mirror. The symbol was examine himself in the mirror, clearer now, intricate and otherworldly, its patterns resembling the ones he had seen on the walls and in his dreams. It didn't just feel foreign, it felt invasive, as though it didn't belong to him. but was now a part of him. "Get off me!" He muttered, scrubbing at the mark with a wet cloth. But the symbol didn't fade. If anything, it glowed brighter, the warmth spreading through his chest and into his arms. He threw the cloth into the sink, gripping the edges of the counter to steady himself. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The day passed in a blur. Ethan couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. He avoided his phone, the fear of another message gnawing at him. But his thoughts kept circling back to the figure, the mark, and fear. Message, you're ready now. It begins. Ready for what? And what was beginning? By the time night fell, exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but he was too afraid to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel the presence of the figure, lingering just out of reach. The mark on his chest pulsed faintly, an unrelenting reminder that he was no longer alone. The house was silent, unnaturally so. Even the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards seemed to have vanished. Ethan sat in the living room, his knees pulled to his chest, the glow of a single lamp the only light in the house. His phone sat on the coffee table, dark and still, and then, just past midnight, the hum returned. It started softly, barely audible, but it grew quickly, reverberating through freely the walls and floor. The mark on Ethan's chest burned, sending waves of heat through his body. He clutched at it, his breathing shallow as the sound intensified, wrapping around him like a cocoon. The lights in the house flickered, then died, plunging him into darkness. Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the room, but the shadows seemed thicker now, almost tangible. A noise from the hallway made him freeze, footsteps slow, deliberate, moving toward him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Ethan's hand tightened around his phone, the light trembling as he pointed it toward the hallway. At first, there was nothing, just the empty stretch of carpet leading to Teacher Stepton, the Paul's front door. But then, slowly, the silhouette emerged from the darkness. It was the figure. Ethan stumbled back, the phone slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. The light spun wildly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. "What do you want from me?" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, before raising a hand. The air around Ethan grew colder, the hum reaching a deafening pitch. Symbols began to appear on the walls again, glowing faintly pitched. As they shifted and aligned, Ethan felt a pressure building in his chest, as though the mark was responding to the figure's presence. The figure took a step forward, and Ethan's legs buckled beneath him. He fell to his knees, gasping for air as the light from the symbols enveloped the room. The melodic voice returned, speaking in the same alien language, its words resonating in his mind. This time, Ethan understood. The symbols were a map, a guide to something ancient and buried. A guide to something ancient and buried, something the figure wanted him to find. The mark on his chest wasn't just a sign, it was a key, a conduit that linked him to the figure and its purpose. "You want me to open it," Ethan whispered, the realization dawning on him. The figure didn't respond, but its presence pressed harder against him, urging him forward. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their light pulsing in time with the mark on his chest. Ethan felt his body move involuntarily, his hand reaching out toward the nearest symbol. The moment his fingers touched it, a surge of energy shot through him. Blinding and overwhelming, the room dissolved around him, replaced by a vast expanse of darkness. Ethan stood on a narrow path, the the symbols from his dreams carved into the ground beneath his feet. The figure was ahead of him now, leading the way. Ethan followed, his steps hesitant but compelled by a force he couldn't resist. The path wound through the void, the air thick with the same melodic hum that had haunted him. In the distance, a faint light appeared, growing steadily brighter as they approached. When they reached it, Ethan stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The light illuminated a massive door, its surface covered in the same intricate symbols as the mark on his chest. The figure stood beside it, waiting. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the door. The mark on his chest burned. The mark on his chest burned brightly, its light merging with the symbols on the door. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his entire body. "What's behind here?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, its presence fading as the door began to shift. Ethan watched in awe and terror as the symbols aligned, the door creaking open to reveal an endless abyss filled with swirling lights and shadows. And then, from the darkness, something moved. Ethan's feet refused to move, rooted to the ground as the door opened wider, revealing the swirling abyss beyond. Lights and shadows twisted together like living things, forming patterns that felt both familiar and impossibly alien. A chill swept over him, carrying a faint whisper, soft yet piercing, like a voice calling to him from the void. The figure didn't follow. It stood just outside the abyss door, its outline barely visible against the swirling backdrop for the first time. Ethan thought he saw something human in its posture, a slouched heaviness, like resignation. It raised a hand, not to threaten him this time, but as though it were gesturing for him to step forward. Ethan's chest tightened, the mark on his skin glowing hotter with each passing second. The urge to move was overpowering now, a compulsion that gnawed at his mind and muscles alike. He took a tentative step toward the door, then another, until he was standing at the threshold. "What's in there?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its outline shimmering faintly. It didn't answer. The whispers from the abyss grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping, their words unintelligible yet filled with meaning. Ethan, intelligible yet filled with meaning, could feel them burrowing into his mind, tugging at memories, emotions, and fears he had buried long ago. And then he stepped through. The world shifted instantly. The cold from before was gone, replaced by a suffocating heat that wrapped around him like a smothering blanket. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid but felt soft, pliant, like flesh. Ethan staggered, his arms flailing to keep his balance as the swirling lights closed in around him. "Where am I?" he whispered, but the words seemed to dissolve in the air, swallowed by the overwhelming hum that pulsed in time with the mark on his chest. Ahead of him, the path stretched into the distance, winding through the abyss. But the lights and shadows were no longer abstract. They began to take shape, forming figures that flickered in and out of existence. Some appeared human, others monstrous, their forms shifting and warping as though trapped between worlds. Ethan's breath hitched as one of the figures turned toward him. Its face was his own, but twisted, its eyes empty, its mouth locked in a silent scream. It reached out, and Ethan stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure dissolved into mist, but others began to emerge, their distorted faces staring at him with a haunting familiarity. "You know them," a voice whispered, low and melodic. Ethan spun around. The figure was behind him now, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just overwhelming. Observing him, it was inside his mind, sifting through his thoughts like pages in a book. "These are your fears," the voice continued. "Your guilt, your failures. You've carried them with you, feeding them, letting them grow." Ethan shook his guy's head, his hands clenching into fists. This isn't real. It's just a dream. The figure stepped closer, its outline sharpening. For the first time, Ethan could make out faint details, a gaunt face, hollow eyes, a mouth that didn't move. When it spoke, "Dreams are windows," it said, "and you've left yours wide open." The path ahead began to shift, the ground writhing like a living thing. Ethan stumbled forward, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving, to stay ahead of it, whatever was closing in behind him. The figures on either side of the path grew more vivid, their distorted forms reaching for him, their whispers merging into a single, overpowering voice. "You called to us?" "I didn't," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. "I don't even know what this is." The mark on his chest burned hotter, the pain searing now, forcing him to his knees. He clutched at it, gasping as the light from the mark spread outward, forming a barrier around him. The figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist once more, but the voice remained, stronger now, filled with anger. "You opened the door." Ethan gritted his teeth, struggling to stand. "What door?" "I don't understand." The figure appeared in front of him again, blocking his path. Its hollow eyes bore into him, unblinking. "The door was always within you. The mark is not a curse. It is your key." "My key to what?" Ethan demanded, his fear giving way to frustration. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, it smiled a cold, joyless expression that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Not what we want," it said. "What you are." Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell. The swirling lights and shadows rushed past him as he plunged deeper into the abyss, the air thickening around him until he felt like he was drowning. His screams were silent, lost in the overwhelming void. When he finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the air from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, dazed and gasping, before forcing himself to sit up. The scene around him had changed again. He was in a vast chamber, its walls carved with the same symbols that had haunted him for days. At the center of the room was an altar, glowing faintly. On it rested a single object, a shard of crystal, pulsing with the same light as the mark on his chest. Ethan staggered to his feet, drawn to the altar despite every instinct, Des screaming at him to turn back. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. "Take it." He shook his head, backing away. "No, I'm not part of this. I didn't ask for this." "You have always been part of this." The figure reappeared, standing beside the altar. Its gaze was steady, unyielding. "The shard will complete the mark, and the door will open fully." Ethan's heart sank. "What's on the other side?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, and the mark on Ethan's chest flared with light, pulling him forward against his will. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. As he reached out involuntarily, his fingers closing around. Involuntarily, his fingers closing around the shard. The moment he touched it, the chamber dissolved into blinding light. The light engulfed Ethan entirely, searing through his vision and leaving him disoriented. The shard in his hand pulsed violently, sending waves of heat through his body. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself as the ground beneath his feet vanished. He was floating now, suspended in a vast, endless void where time and space seemed to collapse into nothingness. And yet, he wasn't alone. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, their alien cadence weaving into something resembling speech. Ethan tried to focus, to make sense of the words, but they slipped through his mind like water through his fingers. The shard's glow intensified, its energy coursing through him until he felt like a live wire, his body barely able to contain the power. Then, out of the void, shapes began to emerge. They were massive, towering structures that seemed to defy geometry. They were massive, towering structures that seemed to defy geometry. Edges sharp and jagged yet constantly shifting. The symbols etched into their surfaces glowed faintly, mirroring the mark on his chest. Ethan reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against one of the symbols. The moment he made contact, a jolt of energy shot through him, and the whispers sharpened into a single, commanding voice. "The door is open," Ethan blinked, the void dissolving around him. He was standing in the chamber again, but it was no longer empty. Figures surrounded him now, their forms similar to the one that had been haunting him, but more distinct, more defined. They moved with purpose, their hollow eyes fixed on the altar at the center of the room. The shard in Ethan's hand glowed brighter, its light spreading outward and illuminating the chamber. The figures didn't approach him. They circled the altar, their movements synchronized, almost ritualistic. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through Ethan's bones. "What is this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing?" One of the figures turned to him, its expression unreadable. "You have brought the shard to its source. The balance will be restored." "Balance?" Ethan repeated, his mind racing. "What balance? What does this have to do with me?" The figure stepped closer, and Ethan took a shaky step back. "You were chosen," it said simply. "Your mark binds you to the door. It cannot be closed without you." Ethan's heart sank. He looked down at the shard in his hand, its light pulsing. He looked down at the shard in his hand, its light pulsing, in time with the mark on his chest. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figures stopped moving. The silence that followed was deafening, the hum cutting out like a switch had been flipped. Ethan felt the weight of their stares, their hollow eyes boring into him. "Refusal is not an option," the figure said, its tone final. Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath him began to shake. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, their patterns shifting into chaotic, fractal shapes. The shard in his hand grew hot, almost unbearable, as the light from the altar intensified. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping and chaotic. Ethan dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the voices drilled into his mind. "The balance is broken. The balance is broken. Door must be sealed. You are the key." The last phrase echoed endlessly, growing louder until it drowned out everything else. Ethan clutched at his chest, the mark burning so brightly now that it illuminated the entire chamber. He felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging him toward the altar. "No!" he shouted, digging his heels into the ground. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want this." But the pull was relentless. The shard in his hand seemed to take on a life of its own, dragging him closer to the altar. The figures watched silently, their forms flickering like shadows in a storm. Ethan's fingers tightened around the shard acid. He fought against the force. "If I do this," he said through gritted teeth, "what happens to me?" The leading figure stepped forward, its gaze unwavering. "You will become the seal. The door will close, and the balance will be restored." "And then?" Ethan demanded, his voice cracking. "What happens to me?" The figure tilted its head. "You'll remain." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He looked around the chamber, at the shifting symbols and the towering figures that seemed to stretch into infinity. The realization sank in, like lead in it. His stomach. If he sealed the door, he would be trapped here forever. The hum returned, louder than ever, as the altar flared with light. The shard in his hand grew impossibly heavy, pulling him closer to the altar until he was inches away. pulling him closer to the altar until he was inches away. The figures surrounded him now, their movements synchronized as they chanted in the melodic language that had haunted his dreams. Ethan's heart raced as he looked at the shard, then at the altar. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the inevitability of his role in this ritual. But a small part of him, the part that still clung to hope, refused to accept it. "There has to be another way," he whispered. The figure nearest to him leaned closer, its hollow eyes, staring into his. There is no other way. The ground beneath Ethan began to crack, the chamber trembling violently as the light from the altar spread outward. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a single, overpowering voice. "Choose?" Ethan stared at the shard in his hand, the mark on his chest burning brighter than ever. His mind raced, torn between the weight of his responsibility and the primal urge to survive. As the chamber began to collapse around him, he made his choice. Ethan's grip on the shard tightened, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a physical force. The voices in the chamber grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that seemed to pull H.U.A. Otter. His very soul. The figures around him moved closer, their forms flickering like shadows on a flame, their hollow eyes unblinking. The ground beneath him cracked further, splitting open to reveal a swirling abyss of light and darkness. Symbols on the walls pulsed wildly, their patterns disintegrating into chaotic fragments. The chamber felt alive, its energy pressing inward as if demanding his decision. "I didn't ask for this," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. "Why me? Why did you choose me?" The leading figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "You carry the mark. The balance has always been tied to you. That doesn't explain anything," Ethan yelled, his frustration boiling over. "What is this balance? What's behind the door? What happens if I walk away?" The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "If the door remains open, the balance will collapse. This world and all others will fall into the void." The shard in Ethan's hand pulsed violently, its glow matching the frantic rhythm of violence. His heart, he could feel the pull again, stronger now, dragging him toward the altar. The figures around him began to chant, their voices merging into a single resonant hum that filled the chamber. The altar flared with light, and Ethan felt the chamber, his knees buckle under the pressure. The mark on his chest burned hotter than ever, the pain searing through his body like fire. He clutched at it, gasping for air, as the shard seemed to grow heavier in his grasp. "Choose," the figure said, again, its voice echoing in the chaotic hum. Ethan's mind raced, torn between the instinct to survive and the knowledge that his refusal could doom everything. His hands trembled as he raised the shard, the light from the altar growing brighter as he moved closer. But then, something shifted. The hum faltered, the symbols on the walls flickering as the ground beneath Ethan steadied. The figures around him stopped moving, their forms frozen as though caught in a moment of uncertainty. The air grew heavy with a new presence, something vast and incomprehensible, pressing against the edges of his perception. The voice that followed was different. It was different. It was deeper, older, resonating, not just in the chamber, but in Ethan's very being. "He is not ready." The figures turned in unison, their movements sharp and deliberate. Ethan looked around wildly, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, only the swirling abyss and the blinding light of the altar. "Who said that?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. The leading figure stepped back, its form flickering as though struggling to maintain its shape. "The Watcher," it said, its tone laced with something Ethan hadn't heard before. Fear? The chamber trembled again. But this time, it wasn't the chaotic collapse of before. It was a deliberate, measured rhythm, like the beating of a colossal heart. The abyss below the altar began to shift, the swirling lights and shadows coalescing into a single, massive form. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the form emerged. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a being of light and shadow, its shape constantly shifting, its presence overwhelming, its gaze, or what felt like a gaze fixed on overwhelming Ethan, and he felt his mind unraveling under its weight. "You are not prepared," the being said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "The mark binds you, but the choice is not yours to make." The shard in Ethan's hand pulsed violently, its light dimming as the being's presence filled the room. The figures around him stepped back, their movements slow and reverent, as though bowing before the entity. "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. "If it's not my choice, then why bring me here? Why put this on me?" The being's form shifted, its edges blurring as it moved closer. "The balance requires a vessel. You have been chosen, but the time is not yet right." Ethan's knees gave out, and he sank to the ground, his chest heaving, the weight of the shard lifted slightly, the burning mark on his chest cooling as the being's light enveloped him. "Then what happens now?" he whispered. The being extended a hand, or what might have been a hand, toward him. The shard in his grasp floated upward, its glow merging with the being's shifting form. The altar dimmed, the symbols on the walls fading into darkness. "The door will remain," the being said, "but the balance is fragile. You are the key, Ethan. When the time comes, you will return." Before Ethan could respond, the light consumed him entirely. He awoke in his bedroom, gasping for air. He awoke in his bedroom, gasping for air. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting the room in warm, golden hues. Everything was quiet, ordinary, as though nothing had happened. But when Ethan looked down, the mark on his chest was still there, faintly glowing. Lethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the faint glow of the mark on his chest. The warmth radiating from it wasn't painful anymore, but its presence was unnerving, a constant reminder that whatever had happened in that otherworldly chamber was real. The shard, the figures, the voice calling itself the Watcher, they weren't just dreams or hallucinations. He pressed his hand over the mark, as if he could smother its glow, but it pulsed softly beneath his touch. It didn't disappear. The clock on his nightstand read 6:47 AM. The sunlight spilling through the blinds was almost mocking in its normalcy. Outside, cars passed by, and the faint chatter of morning commuters seeped through the window. But inside, Ethan's world had been irreparably altered. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, half expecting another cryptic message from the unknown number. But the screen was blank, the silence almost unsettling after the relentless hum of the chamber. For a moment, he dared to hope that whatever had happened was over, but the mark's faint glow told him otherwise. The day passed in a haze. Ethan tried to go about his routine breakfast, coffee, even a half-hearted attempt at answering work emails, but everything felt distant, disconnected. The mark's presence was a constant distraction, its pulsing rhythm aligning too perfectly with his heartbeat. It was as if it were alive, tethered to him in a way he couldn't understand. By mid-afternoon, the tension became unbearable. Ethan found himself scrolling through forums and message boards, searching for anything that might explain what had happened to him. He typed in keywords, symbols, recurring dreams, glowing marks, but the results gray. Diaries, Panarders porn of Dairies can forty and match games teach some with calls. What we go gynepating? These pictures fan. What were either vague occult theories or outright conspiracies. Then he stumbled across something that made his breath catch. A user on an obscure forum had posted a description eerily similar to Ethan's experience. Recurring dreams, shadowy figures. Recurring dreams, shadowy figures. A burning mark that appeared after encountering something they called the threshold. The post was old, from years ago, but the details matched too closely to dismiss. He clicked on the user's profile, only to find that they hadn't been active in it years. Their last post was cryptic. "The door is open. I can stop what's coming." That night, the house felt different. Ethan had spent the day convincing himself that he was safe, that whatever had happened in that chamber was behind him. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew heavy, charged with the same oppressive stillness he'd felt in the chamber. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the soft hum of the TV. But every shadow in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping toward him. The mark on his chest pulsed faintly, as if responding to something unseen. Ethan pressed a hand over it, trying to steady his breathing. "Not again," he whispered. "Please, not again." The lights, "not again," flickered. He froze, his eyes darting to the overhead bulb as it dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again. The TV cut out, replaced by static that buzzed in the silence. Ethan's heart pounded as he grabbed his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The moment the beam of light cut through the darkness, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the static, but they grew louder, closer, weaving into the same melodic language that had haunted his dreams. Ethan turned in circles, the flashlight trembling in his hand as he searched for the source. And then he saw it. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure, its outline shifting like a shadow caught in a storm. I didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Ethan's voice broke as he called out, "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "The balance falters," it said, its voice resonating in the air. "You must return." Ethan shook his head, backing away, stepped forward, its movements smooth and deliberate. "The door is not closed. The Watcher's will is incomplete. I don't care," Ethan shouted, his back hitting the wall. "I didn't ask for this. I'm not your key, or whatever you think I am." The figure stopped inches from him, its presence overwhelming. "You carry the mark," it said simply. "You are bound." Ethan's legs gave out, and he slid to the floor, his chest heaving. "You are bound." Ethan's legs gave out, and he slid to the floor, his chest heaving. The mark burned again, the pain spreading through his body like fire. The whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with fragments of alien symbols and fleeting images of the abyss. The figure knelt beside him. Its hollow eyes unblinking. "The balance is fragile. If the door remains open, the void will consume all." Ethan's vision blurred, his body trembling under the weight of the mark's energy. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not ready for this." The figure's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "You are not alone." Before Ethan could respond, the mark flared brightly, blinding him. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. When his vision cleared, the figure was gone, and the house was still. But the mark's pulsing was stronger now, and Ethan knew deep down that this was far from over. The house was silent again, but it was the wrong kind of silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the kind of oppressive stillness that made Ethan's skin crawl. Every breath he took felt heavier, as though the air itself was laced with unseen weight. He sat on the floor, staring at the faint glow of the mark on his chest. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "The door is not closed. The void will consume all." He clutched his knees, rocking slightly as he tried to piece everything together. The shard, the watcher, the endless abyss, they were fragments of something far larger, something he barely understood, and yet he was at the center of it. The mark pulsed faintly, drawing his attention. It didn't feel threatening now, but it wasn't benign either. It was a reminder, a tether to whatever force had chosen him. He traced its outline with shaking fingers, the warmth beneath his skin almost comforting. Almost, by morning, the tension in the air hadn't lifted. Ethan barely slept, his body too wired from the encounter to relax. When the sun rose, he forced himself to leave the house, desperate for the normalcy of the outside world. The streets were bustling with the usual chaos of morning commuters, their hurried steps and car horns oddly grounding, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers hadn't returned, and the mark had stopped glowing, but the weight of the previous night lingered. He walked aimlessly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes scanning every shadow for movement. Every now and then, he caught glimpses of something in his peripheral vision, a flicker of motion, a faint outline that vanished the milkly from nightly. Faintin scowl. He found himself standing in front of the public library, its grand stone facade offering a sense of permanence he hadn't felt in days. On a whim, he walked inside, the quiet hum of the space calming his frayed nerves. He didn't know what he was looking for, but his feet carried him to the research. The search term came to him unbidden. The Watcher. Most of the results were vague, cryptic references in esoteric texts and obscure mythology. Ethan flipped through old books, their musty pages filled with passages about cosmic entities, ancient rituals, and the balance between worlds. None of it made sense, but one passage caught his eye. The Watcher stands at the threshold, neither of the void nor of the light. It guards the balance, but it does not intervene. Only those who bear the mark may close the door and restore what is broken. Ethan's chest tightened. The words felt like they were written for him, though the book was centuries old. He scanned the rest of the page, but it was filled with up symbols similar to the ones he had seen in his dreams and on the walls of the chamber. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly, as though responding to his gaze. His vision blurred, the letters twisting into patterns that seared into his mind. Gasp, snapping the book shut as the hum returned, faint but unmistakable. "Not here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not now." Ethan stumbled out of the library, his head spinning. The hum followed him, growing louder with each step. He clutched at his chest, the mark burning faintly as the air around him thickened. The bustling streets blurred, the noise of the city fading into the background as the whispers began to creep into his mind. He ducked into an alley, pressing his back against the cold brick wall as he tried to steady his breathing. The whispers grew louder, forming fragments of the melodic language he'd come to dread. His vision swam, the shadows in the alley shifting, unnatural. And then he saw it. At the far end of the alley, the figure stood motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on him. It didn't move, but its presence filled the space, pressing down on Ethan like a physical weight. "You said I wasn't ready," Ethan said. "His head wasn't ready," Ethan said. His voice shaky. "Why are you here now?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward him. The mark on his chest flared with light, the pain searing as it spread through his body. Ethan doubled over, gasping, as the world around him dissolved into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the chamber. The altar was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and shadow that stretched into infinity. The figures surrounded him again, their forms flickering as they chanted in unison. Big symbols on the walls glowed brightly, their patterns shifting into something Ethan couldn't comprehend. The Watcher's voice boomed, cutting through the cacophony. the balance weakens, the door must be sealed. Ethan staggered to his feet. Body trembling under the weight of the mark's energy. I don't know how, he said, his voice breaking. You keep telling me I'm the key, but I don't even know what that means. The Watcher's form materialized before him, towering and immense. Its gaze bore into him, its presence overwhelming. You are the bridge. The void calls to you because you are tied to it. Only through you can the door be closed. Ethan shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. And if I don't? What happens then? The Watcher's voice was calm, but unyielding. The void consumes all. The vortex flared, its energy crackling through the chamber. Ethan felt the pull again, stronger than ever, dragging him toward the swirling abyss. The figures chanted louder, their voices rising in a haunting crescendo as the symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the mark on his chest. You're asking me to sacrifice everything, Ethan said, his voice trembling. Why me? Why did you choose me? The Watcher's form shifted, its edges blurring as it loomed closer. You were chosen because you are connected to both worlds. The mark binds you, but the choice is yours. Ethan's heart pounded as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The vortex roared, the chamber trembling as the void threatened to spill through. The mark burned brighter, its light merging with the symbols on the walls. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Ethan looked at the swirling abyss, then back at the Watcher. If I do this, what happens to me? The Watcher's gaze didn't waver. You will become part of the seal. Your existence will anchor the balance. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands trembling. He felt the pull of the void, the weight of the mark, the inevitability of the choice before him. And then he stepped toward the vortex. Ethan's foot hesitated just above the edge of the vortex. The swirling mass of light and shadow seemed alive, writhing as though it anticipated his arrival. The pull on the mark in his chest was stronger than ever, a force both physical and intangible that compelled him forward. But in his heart, fear screamed louder. Wait, he called out, his voice cracking. If I become part of the seal, will I still exist? Will I? He couldn't finish the thought. The idea of vanishing, of becoming nothing, was too much to voice. The Watcher's towering form shifted slightly, as if considering his question. You will persist, but not as you are. The seal transcends form, memory, and time. You will become balance. Ethan's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground. He clutched his head, his mind spinning. This wasn't a choice, it was a demand. A cruel trade where the only reward was the survival of a world that would never know what he'd sacrificed. Why me? He whispered, his voice hollow. The Watcher moved closer, its presence casting a shadow even in the swirling brightness of the chamber. The mark is no accident. It was given to you because you have always straddled the boundary between lightway and void. I didn't choose this boundary, Ethan shouted, anger flaring in his chest. You just gave it to me. You ruined my life and then made me responsible for everything. The Watcher didn't answer. Its silence was deafening. The figures surrounding the vortex chanted louder, their voices merging into a steady hum that vibrated through the chamber. The walls cracked and splintered, pieces of the symbols breaking away and dissolving into the air. The vortex swirled faster, its energy seeping through the cracks as the balance continued to destabilize. Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift, the entire chamber trembling violently. He looked up at the silently Watcher, his chest heaving. If I don't do this, what happens? The Watcher extended one of its shapeless arms, and the air before Ethan shimmered. A vision appeared his world, but not as it was. The streets were empty, the skies blackened, and the buildings crumbled into nothingness. Faint whispers echoed through the scene, haunting and broken. This is what awaits, the Watcher said, The void does not stop, it consumes, and it has already begun. Ethan stared at the vision, his body frozen. The image shifted, showing familiar places, his home, his neighborhood, all collapsing into the same abyss he had seen behind the door. "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Wait, the door must be sealed, or the void will take all." Ethan gritted his teeth, his hands clenching into fists. He hated this. He hated the Watcher, the figures, the mark on his chest that tied him to all of this. He hated the idea that his life had been stolen from him without his consent, and now he was expected to give up what little remained. But more than anything, he hated the thought of watching his world fall apart while he did nothing. The mark on his chest burned, hotter, its pulsing rhythm matching the frantic churn of the vortex. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to his feet. He looked at the Watcher, then at the figures, and finally at the swirling void before him. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll seal the door." The chamber fell silent. The figures stopped chanting, their forms flickering as they turned to face him. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, their chaotic patterns aligning into intricate, glowing sequences. The vortex slowed, its energy condensing into a single point of blinding light. The Watcher extended its arm again, the mark on Ethan's chest responding with an intense glow. "Step forward, and the balance will be restored." Ethan swallowed hard, his legs trembling as he moved toward the edge of the vortex. The energy around it crackled and roared, sending waves of heat and cold through his body. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to fight forward his survival, but he kept moving. When he reached the edge, he paused. His heart pounded as he looked into the swirling mass of light and shadow. For a moment, he thought he saw something within it. Figures, faces, fragments of memories that felt like his own but also not. "Will it hurt?" he asked, his voice trembling. The Watcher's response was quiet, almost gentle. "Yes." Ethan closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He took one final breath, then stepped into the vortex. The pain was immediate, searing through every fiber of his being. It wasn't just physical. It was everything. His memories, his emotions, his sense of self, all of it was pulled apart, unraveled, and stripped away. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the maelstrom of light and shadow. The mark on his chest flared one final time, its light merging with the vortex. The swirling mass began to contract, folding in on itself as the chamber trembled violently. The symbols on the walls dissolved into streams of light, converging on the vortex as it collapsed. And then, suddenly, there was silence. The chamber was gone. The figures were gone. The Watcher was gone. Ethan was gone. Ethan was gone. In his place, there was only light, a soft, steady glow that filled the space where the vortex had been. The balance had been restored, and the door was sealed, but somewhere, in the quiet hum of the light, a faint whisper remained. It was Ethan's voice, distant and fading. "I'm still here." Ethan clutched his chest as the mark pulsed harder, its searing heat spreading through his body like molten fire. The Watcher's words echoed in his mind. "You will persist, but not as you are." They weren't comforting. They weren't meant to be. His breathing grew, shallow, his eyes darting between the figures surrounding him and the vortex. The chamber trembled as if impatient, the symbols on the walls shifting faster, their glow blinding. The pull toward the vortex became unbearable, dragging him closer, even as he tried to plant his feet. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why did it have to be me?" The Watcher stepped closer, its vast, shifting form towering over him. "The mark binds you to both worlds. You were chosen, Because you are the bridge. I never asked for this, Ethan shouted, his voice raw. I don't want to be a bridge. I don't want to sacrifice myself for some balance I don't even understand. The Watcher tilted its head, its hollow gaze piercing. The void does not ask. It takes. Without the seal, all will fall. The figures around Ethan resumed their chanting, their voices rising in unison with the hum of the vortex. The light and shadows swirled violently now, reaching out in tendrils that clawed at the edges of the chamber. The abyss was expanding, its hunger palpable. Ethan staggered to his feet, his hands trembling as he stared into the void. Images began to flash before his eyes, memories, fragments of his life, his childhood home, his mother's laugh, the first time he fell in love. They appeared and disappeared in an instant, replaced by fleeting glimpses of the abyss, endless darkness devouring everything it touched. He turned to the Watcher, desperation in his voice. There has to be another way, another seal, someone else, anything but this. The Watcher didn't move. The seal requires the mark. The mark is yours. There is no other way. The ground beneath Ethan cracked again, splitting open as the vortex's tendrils lashed out, consuming everything they touched. The figures chanted tats, louder, their forms flickering like broken shadows. The mark on Ethan's chest flared brighter, the pain now unbearable. He fell to his knees, clutching at the searing glow. The pull of the vortex was irresistible now, dragging him closer with each passing moment. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping into a cacophony that filled his mind. The door must close. The balance must hold. You are the key. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he looked into the abyss. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to disappear, but the images of destruction, worlds crumbling, lives consumed by darkness played in his mind like a loop. He couldn't let it happen, not if there was a chance to stop it. Tell me, he said, his voice trembling. Will it hurt? The Watcher's form shimmered. Pain is fleeting. Balance is eternal. Ethan took a shaky breath, his resolve hardening. If this was the price to stop the void, to protect the world, then he would pay it. He stepped forward, his body trembling as the vortex pulled him closer. The figures stopped chanting, their hollow eyes fixed on him as he reached the edge. The mark on his chest burned brighter, its light merging with the swirling energy of the abyss. The vortex roared, its tendrils wrapping around him like chains. Ethan gasped as the energy surged through him, his body and mind overwhelmed by its power. The last thing he saw was the Watcher, its form towering over him, its voice calm and unyielding. You are unyielding! The seal, and then the light consumed him. Silence for a moment. There was nothing. No sound, no light, no sense of time or space. Ethan floated in the void, his thoughts scattered, his body weightless. He felt himself unraveling, his memories slipping away like grains of sand in a tide. But then, slowly, something shifted. A faint hum resonated through the darkness, steady and rhythmic. It grew louder, more distinct, until Ethan realized it wasn't coming from the void it was coming from within him. The mark on his chest flared one final time, its energy spreading outward in a wave of light that pushed back the shadows. The vortex began to shrink, its tendrils retreating as the light consumed it. The symbols on white consumed it. The symbols on. The walls glowed brighter, their patterns stabilizing, locking into place. The chamber trembled one last time before falling still. Ethan felt himself dissolve, his essence merging with the light. He was no longer a person, no longer bound by his form or time. He was the seal now, the bridge that held the balance between worlds. And as the door closed, the void was silenced. The void was gone, silenced by the seal Ethan had become. The chamber no longer pulsed with chaotic energy. Instead, a calm, steady rhythm filled the air, as if the space itself was breathing for the first time in eons. The figures surrounding the vortex flickered briefly before dissolving into faint motes of light, their purpose fulfilled. But Ethan motes of light was not entirely gone. In the vast stillness where the void once churned, something remained, a faint presence, an echo of the man who had been. Ethan's thoughts were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror scattered across a vast expanse. He could feel the balance stabilizing, the world settling into harmony, yet there was no sense of self, no body, no boundaries to anchor him. Time was meaningless here. Days, years, or even centuries could have passed, and Ethan would not have known. But slowly, faint glimmers of awareness began to surface. Fragments of his memories, his mother's laugh, the smell of rain, the warmth of sunlight on his skin, drifted through the endless light. They were small, fleeting, but they were small, fleeting, but they were. I'm still here, he thought, though he wasn't sure what here meant anymore. Meanwhile, in the world Ethan had left behind, subtle changes rippled through reality. The sky seemed clearer, the air lighter, as though an unseen weight had been lifted. The people living their ordinary lives couldn't explain it, but they felt it, a faint sense of peace, a quiet assurance that something dark and ancient had passed them by. But for a few, the change was not so subtle. In the depths of a university archive, a professor of ancient languages stumbled across a set of glowing symbols etched into a centuries-old tablet. The patterns were familiar, identical to the ones Ethan had seen in the chamber. But now they seemed unseen in the chamber, to pulse with a faint light, as though they were alive, far away. In a quiet town by the sea, a child woke from a dream they couldn't remember. They sat up in bed, clutching their chest, their small hand resting over a faint, glowing mark that hadn't been there the night before. And in a high-rise office, a man working late froze as his computer screen flickered, the symbols briefly flashing across the display before vanishing. His heart raced, though he couldn't explain why. He had no memory of Ethan, no knowledge of the balance or the void, but he felt a connection, a faint pull, like a distant echo calling to him. Ethan's presence lingered, woven into the fabric of the worlds he had saved. He was the seal. He was the seal. The bridge that held the balance, but he was more than that. He was a whisper in the wind, a shimmer in the light, a faint hum that resonated in the quiet moments of existence over time. His awareness grew stronger. He began to sense the people connected to him, their thoughts and emotions faint but discernible. The child by the sea who bore a new mark, the professor deciphering the symbols, the man haunted by flickering visions, they were all part of the balance now. Just as he was, Ethan didn't know what it meant, not yet, but he felt something stirring, a new purpose, a new chapter beginning. The door was sealed, but the story wasn't over. Time flowed differently for Ethan now. He was no longer bound to the linear march of hours and days. Instead, he existed within the rhythm of the balance itself, a constant hum of stability, a pulse that resonated through the fabric of reality. Yet, despite his disembodied state, fragments of his humanity persisted. He could feel the world he'd left behind. At first, it was faint, a whisper in the back of his consciousness, like a distant melody carried on the wind. But as the balance strengthened, so did his awareness. He could sense the flickers of lives. He could sense the flickers of lives, intertwined with the mark. The professor studying ancient symbols, the child by the sea, the man haunted by visions, their emotions, their questions. their growing connection to the balance. They were beacons in the vast expanse of his new existence. And then, one day, or what felt like a day, Ethan heard the first call. It came from the child. Her name was Maeve. She was 7 years old and lived in a small house perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The mark had appeared on a portrait at Paiksa Cranes Michigan. Her chest the night Ethan became the seal. But she didn't fear it. Instead, she was curious. She would sit by her window at night, tracing the glowing lines with her fingers and whispering to it. "What are you?" she would ask. "Why are you here?" Her voice reached Ethan like ripples on a still pond. He couldn't answer, not yet, but her presence anchored him, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt since the chamber. She was part of the balance now, a piece of the intricate web that connected worlds. And through her, Ethan began to understand his new role. The balance wasn't static. It wasn't permanent. It required vigilance, care, and sometimes intervention. Ethan wasn't just the seal. He was its guardian across the world. The professor doctor. Elias Trent was unraveling pieces of the puzzle. The glowing symbols on the ancient tablet had initially defied his attempts to translate them, but after weeks of study, patterns began to emerge. The symbols weren't just language. They were a map, a guide to the forces that bound reality together. The more Elias studied, the more he felt the symbols reaching out to him. They glowed brighter when he touched them, their patterns shifting as if responding to his reckless, fairies thoughts. And late at night, when the library was empty, he swore he could hear a faint hum emanating from the tablet. One night, as he traced the lines of a particularly intricate symbol, a vision flashed before his eyes. It was brief but vivid, a vast chamber filled with swirling light and shadow, a towering figure with hollow eyes, and a man with a glowing mark on his chest, standing at the edge of a vortex. Elias stumbled back, his heart racing. He didn't know what he had seen, but he felt certain of one thing. The man with the mark was important, and somehow Elias was connected to him. In the city, the man haunted by visions, Darren Cole, was unraveling. He had always prided himself on his sharp mind. His logical approach to life. But ever since the symbols had appeared on his computer screen, his world had started to fracture. The symbols would flash at random, on street signs, in reflections, even in his dreams. And with them came a feeling. He couldn't shake a sense that he was being watched. At first, he tried to dismiss it as stress, a trick of his overworked mind, but the more he ignored it, the more persistent it became. One night, as he stared at his computer screen, the symbols flared brightly, filling the room with an unearthly light. Darren blinked, shielding his eyes, and when he looked back, a single word appeared on the screen. "Help!" Darren's stomach dropped. His hands trembled as he reached for the reached for the keyboard, unsure of what to type before he could decide. The screen flickered, and another word appeared. "Find them." Ethan watched these threads unfold, their lives weaving into the balance in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. He felt their confusion, their fear, their growing awareness of the mark's significance. And though he couldn't speak to them directly, he could guide them. Through Maeve, he sent dreams, fragments of light and shadow. The truth. Through Elias, he nudged the glowing tablet, revealing pieces of the map that would lead to answers. And through Darren, he sent the urgent message that the balance was not as stable as it seemed, because Ethan had begun to sense something else. The void was stirring. It was faint at first, a distant tremor in the rhythm of the balance, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. A dark pulse that resonated in the corners of existence. Ethan knew what it meant. Seal was holding, but it wasn't enough. The void was testing its boundaries, probing for weaknesses, and it wasn't just the void. Something else, something intelligent was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, lurking in the shadows, its presence cold and calculating. It wasn't like the Watcher, which had existed to preserve the balance. This was something darker, something that thrived on chaos and destruction. The balance wasn't just fragile. Was under attack. Ethan's awareness stretched like tendrils across the fabric of the balance. The void stirring was no longer a faint tremor. It had grown into a persistent thrum, like a heartbeat in the distance. And yet it wasn't just the void testing the seal. There was something else, a presence darker and more deliberate. He could feel its focus cold, calculating, and ancient. This wasn't a chaotic force like the void, but a conscious entity, one that thrived on the cracks entity. The balance. The seal wasn't enough. Not anymore. Ethan's tether to the balance allowed him to nudge the lives of those connected to the mark, but he knew it wasn't enough either. Maeve, Elias, and Darren were beginning to sense the threads, pulling them into something far bigger than themselves, but they didn't yet understand their roles, and time was running out. Maeve sat on the rocky cliff near her home, her legs dangling over the edge as she stared at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, its waves crashing against the rocks below. She traced the glowing mark on her chest with her fingers, her expression thoughtful. Her dreams had been strange lately. Vivid images of swirling light and shadow, of towering figures with hollow eyes, of a man standing at the edge of a great vortex. She didn't know what they meant, but they didn't scare her. If anything, they felt familiar. That night, as she lay in bed, the dreams came, again. But this time, they were clearer. She was in a vast chamber, surrounded by glowing symbols that pulsed like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The man with the mark stood before her, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "You have to be brave," he said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You're part of this now?" Maeve reached out to touch his hand, but the dream shattered like glass, and she woke with a start. The mark on her chest glowed brighter than ever, pulsing in time with the echoes of his voice. Elias, Doctor. Elias Trent's hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the ancient tablet. The symbols on its surface were alive now, shifting and rearranging themselves with a logic he couldn't grasp. He had spent weeks trying to translate them, and every breakthrough led to more questions. The vision of the chamber haunted him. The man with the mark, Ethan, he'd come to call him, felt like a key, but to what? Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was tied to the balance the symbols hinted at, a force that bound existence together. Late that night, as he studied the tablet in the dim light of his office, the symbols flared with a blinding intensity. The room filled with a low hum, and Elias stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When the light faded, the tablet had changed. The symbols now formed a map, a path leading to a single point, a location Elias recognized instantly. It was instantly. It was in the middle of the ocean, far from any landmass. His pulse quickened. He didn't know what he'd find there, but he knew he had to go. Darren Cole paced his small apartment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The visions clenching at his sides had become more frequent, the symbols appearing everywhere he turned. But it was the messages that terrified him the most. Find them. Help. The balance is breaking. He didn't know who they were or how he was supposed to help, but the urgency in the messages was impossible to ignore. Darren had spent hours researching the symbols, desperate for answers, but every search led to dead ends, or worse, to dark whispers about forces beyond comprehension. One night, the symbols beyond comprehension. One night, the symbols appeared again, this time on his bathroom mirror, etched in faint, glowing lines. Darren stared at them. his reflection distorted by the pulsing light. And then, for the first time, he heard a voice, not a whisper, but a clear, steady command. Go to the water. The watcher's warning as Ethan observed these threads converge. He felt a shift in the balance. The void stirring grew stronger, its tendrils testing the seal with increasing force. And the darker presence, the one guys that watched, waited, was moving closer. Ethan reached out through the balance, his presence brushing against the watcher. Its form loomed like a shadow against the light, vast and inscrutable. The seal is weakening, Ethan said. The void isn't stopping. The seal holds, the watcher replied. But the balance is fragile. There's something else, Ethan pressed. Something alive. It's feeding on the cracks. The watcher's silence was unnerving. Finally, it spoke. Its voice silence was unnerving. Finally, it spoke, low and foreboding. The void is not the only threat. The darkness you sense has no name, but it has always sought to destroy the balance. It awakens when the seal is weak. What do I do? Ethan asked. I can't stop it alone. You are not alone, the watcher said. The threads are converging. They will find you. The gathering storm, Elias, Maeve, and Darren were being drawn together, their paths unknowingly aligning. The symbols, the dreams, the marks, they were all pieces of a puzzle that pointed toward the ocean, to the place where the balance had first been broken. Ethan could feel their fear, their confusion, but also their determination. They didn't yet understand the roles they would play, but they were moving toward him, toward the seal, and the darkness was moving too. It crept through the cracks in the balance, a cold, insidious presence that spread like a shadow over the world. It whispered to those who would listen, sowing chaos and despair. It wasn't just testing the seal, it was preparing to shatter it. Ethan braced himself. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Maeve, the whispering waves. Maeve stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, the wind pulling at her hair as the waves crashed below. The mark on her chest was warm again, pulsing in rhythm with the ocean's roar. She stared out at the horizon, where the sky bled into the water, her small hand resting over the faintly glowing symbol that night. Her dreams had been more vivid than ever. The man with the mark, Ethan, had spoken to her, his voice clear yet tinged with urgency. You need to find them, he'd said. There's not much time. She didn't know who they were, but she felt the pull, a tugging sensation in her chest that wouldn't let her rest. Her parents didn't understand when she tried to explain it. They thought it was just her imagination, a child's fantasy, but Maeve knew better. Don't be scared, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible over the wind. The mark pulsed brighter, as if responding to her resolve. Somewhere out there, the answers waited. Elias, the journey begins, Doctor. Elias, the journey begins, Doctor? Elias Trent had always considered himself a man of logic, grounded in the tangible world of academia. But as he stared at the glowing map etched into the ancient tablet, logic felt like a distant memory. The symbols had shifted again, forming a clear path that ended in the middle of the ocean. He had tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a trick of his overworked mind. But the vision of the chamber, the swirling light and shadow, the towering figure, the man with the mark had left him shaken. He couldn't ignore the pull any longer that evening. Elias found himself booking a flight to the nearest coastal city. From there, he would hire a boat and follow the map's instructions, no matter how absurd it seemed. He couldn't explain why he felt so compelled, but deep down, he knew the answers lay beyond the horizon. The symbols on the tablet pulsed faintly as he packed his bag, their glow casting strange patterns across the walls of his office. The hum in the air grew louder, a low vibration that resonated in his chest. I hope I'm not losing my mind, he muttered as he zipped up his bag. but something told him this wasn't madness. It was destiny. Darren. The call of the void. Darren sat in his dimly lit apartment, his eyes fixed on the glowing symbols that now seemed to haunt his every waking moment. The message on his computer screen, "Go to the water," played over and over in his mind. It was absurd, nonsensical, and yet he couldn't ignore it. The visions had grown worse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the same swirling vortex, the same towering figures, the same man with the mark. He didn't know who the man was, but he felt connected to him, as though their fates were intertwined. Finally, Darren couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his coat and left the apartment, the faint hum following him like a ghost. The streets were quiet, the air unnaturally still as he made his way to the waterfront. The mark on his chest burned faintly, a steady pulse that guided his steps. When he reached the edge of the pier, he froze. The water was black and calm, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the city lights. But as Darren stared into the depths, the symbols appeared again, rippling across the water like fireflies. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The symbols flared brightly, and for a brief moment, he saw something beneath the surface, a vast, shifting shadow, its form too immense to comprehend. Darren stumbled back, his heart racing, and then the whispers came again. "Find them. Ethan." The seal weakens. Ethan felt their movements like threads in a web, each tugging at the balance in its own way. Maeve, Elias, Darren. They were being drawn together, their fates converging as the mark guided them toward the same destination. But the void's presence loomed larger now, its tendrils reaching through the cracks in the seal. The darkness he had sensed before was no longer distant. It was here. It moved through the void like a predator, coiling around the edges of the balance and testing its strength. Ethan could feel its hunger, its desire to consume everything in its path, and it was no longer content to wait. Through the balance, Ethan reached out to the Watcher. Its towering form appeared, its hollow eyes unblinking as it gazed at him. "The darkness is moving," Ethan said. "The seal won't hold?" The Watcher's voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency. "The seal holds, but the balance is holds, but the balance is shifting. The threads are not yet aligned." "Then help me," Ethan pleaded. "If this thing breaks through, nothing will survive." The Watcher's form shimmered. "You are the seal. You are the bridge. They must come to you." The darkness stirs. The darkness stirs. In the depths of the void, the darkness pulsed. It wasn't chaos, but something far more dangerous, an ancient intelligence that had waited patiently for eons. Now, with the seal weakened and the balance faltering, it saw its chance, whispered to those who would listen, sowing doubt and fear in the minds of the living. Its tendrils reached into the dreams of the vulnerable, twisting their thoughts and bending their will. And it had noticed the threads converging: the child, the scholar, the haunted man. They were threats, but also opportunities. The darkness knew that the balance could not be restored without sacrifice. If it could corrupt the threads, twist them to its purpose, the seal would shatter. Seal would shatter, only a matter of time. "Maeve." A voice beneath the waves. The night was unusually quiet as Maeve sat on her bed, clutching a small seashell she'd found on the beach that morning. Its smooth surface felt comforting in her hand. A tiny piece of normalcy amid the growing strangeness of her world. The mark on her chest glowed faintly in the dim light, its rhythm steady but insistent. When Maeve closed her eyes, she heard it again, the voice. It was soft, almost like a lullaby. Carried again, the voice, on the ebb and flow of the waves. But this time, it wasn't just Ethan's voice. There was something else, something colder. "Come closer," it whispered, Maeve's eyes snapped open. The room was silent except for the faint creak of the house settling, but the whisper lingered in her mind, pulling at her thoughts. She climbed out of bed and padded to the window, the cool night air brushing her face as she looked out at the ocean. The waves seemed to shimmer under the moonlight, their movement unnatural, as though they were alive. The mark on her chest burned brighter, and Maeve felt the pull again, stronger than before. She wasn't afraid. She was curious. Elias. The map's warning Elias stood at the edge of the dock, his bag slung over one shoulder as he stared at the small fishing boat bobbing in the water. The captain, an older man with weathered skin and a skeptical expression, was already growing impatient. "You sure about this?" the captain asked, his voice gruff. "There's nothing out there but water." "I'm sure," Elias replied. Though his voice lacked conviction, he patted the tablet tucked safely in his bag, its symbols now forming a clear path that ended far beyond the horizon. "I just need to get to this location." The captain shrugged. "Your money, your funeral," as the boat set off. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The symbols on the tablet glowed faintly, casting an eerie light through the bag. When he pulled it out to study the map, the hum returned, louder this time, as if warning him. The water beneath the boat rippled unnaturally, and Elias thought he saw something, a shadow, moving just beneath the surface. He leaned over the edge, his heart racing, but the shadow was gone. "Focus," he muttered to himself, gripping the edge of the boat. "Just get to the coordinates." But the hum grew louder, and Elias couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. Whatever was waiting for him out there wasn't just ancient. It was alive. Darren. The abyss calls. Darren stood on the pier, the cold wind biting at his face as he stared at the black water. The symbols rippling across the surface were at him, gone now, but their afterimage burned in his mind. His chest felt heavy, the mark beneath his shirt pulsing faintly as if it were alive. The voice had been clearer this time, its command impossible to ignore. "Find them." "Who are you?" Darren whispered into the darkness. "Why me?" The water didn't answer, but as Darren turned to leave, he froze. A figure stood at the end of the pier, its silhouette barely visible in the faint light. It didn't move, did speak, but its presence was suffocating. Darren's legs trembled as he took a step back. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, and Darren felt the mark on his chest flare with heat. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping into a cacophony that filled his mind. "The balance is breaking." The figure dissolved into shadow, leaving Darren alone on the pier, but the mark continued to burn, and Darren knew there was no turning back. He had to find the others. He had to stop whatever was coming. Ethan, guiding the threads, Ethan watched as the threads of fate pulled tighter, drawing Maeve, Elias, and Darren closer to the ocean, closer to him. Their fear and confusion rippled through the balance, but so did their determination. They didn't understand their roles yet, but they were moving toward the answers, toward the seal. But the darkness was moving too. Ethan could feel its tendrils probing the edges of the balance, searching for weaknesses. It had noticed the convergence of the threads, and it was preparing to strike. The void's chaos was no longer the only threat. The darkness had taken form, and it was watching. Through the balance, Ethan reached out to Maeve, his presence brushing against her thoughts like a whisper. "Be strong," he told her. "You're not alone." He sent the same message to Elias and Darren, nudging them toward the convergence. But the darkness felt his efforts, and its response was immediate. The tendrils lashed out, disrupting the threads, sowing fear and doubt in the minds of those he was trying to protect. Ethan braced himself against the onslaught, his presence flickering as the darkness pressed against the seal. He couldn't let it break them. If the threads failed to converge, the balance would fail to converge. The balance would collapse. The darkness strikes in the depths of the void. The darkness coiled tighter, its form solidifying as it fed on the cracks in the seal. It whispered to those who could hear it, twisting their thoughts and bending their will. It reached into the dreams of the vulnerable, planting seeds of despair, and then it moved. The ocean churned violently, waves rising high as the darkness extended its reach. The hum of the balance faltered, the symbols on the seal flickering as Void's chaos surged forward. The threads were converging, but the darkness was faster. It would stop them. It would stop them. It would break the seal, and when it did, the void would consume everything. Maeve, drawn to the deep, Maeve stood on the rocky shoreline as the waves grew restless, churning and frothing like something alive. The mark on her chest burned hotter now, the pulse no longer a gentle rhythm but an urgent demand. She clutched the seashell tightly in her hand, her small fingers had Neri in her hand, her small fingers trembling. The whispers returned, louder than ever, carried by the wind and waves. But they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices overlapping and chaotic, calling her name. Maeve, come to us. Her knees buckled as she stared at the ocean, her heart racing. The moonlit water seemed to ripple unnaturally, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. She saw shadows moving beneath the surface, vast and serpentine, as if something ancient was stirring. I'm not afraid, she whispered, though her voice trembled. The mark flared brightly, illuminating the darkness around her. Maeve stepped closer to the water, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. The pull was irresistible now, drawing her toward the horizon, and then she heard it, Ethan's voice, cutting through the chaos. Hold on, Maeve. Help is coming. Elias. Into the unknown, the small fishing boat rocked violently as the waves grew more aggressive, slamming against the hull with relentless force. Elias gripped the edge of the boat, his knuckles white as he stared at the glowing tablet in his hands. The map was clearer now, the symbols shifting to form a beacon that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. We're close, he muttered, though his voice was barely audible over the roar of the ocean. The captain shouted something from the helm, but Elias couldn't hear him. His focus was entirely on the water. Shadows moved beneath the surface, large and unearthly, circling the boat like predators. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through Elias's chest. The tablet's glow intensified, and for a brief moment, he saw a figure standing on the water ahead, a child, bathed in light. Maeve, he whispered, the name coming to him unbidden. The boat lurched as another wave slammed into it, sending Elias sprawling. The tablet slipped from his hands, landing on the deck with a heavy thud, but its glow didn't tell him fade. Instead, it pulsed brighter, casting eerie patterns across the stormy waves. Darren. The shadow beckons. Darren's heart pounded as he stumbled along the rocky shore, the crashing waves soaking his shoes and jeans. The whispers had grown louder, their commands twisting into an unrelenting chorus in his mind. He couldn't escape them, couldn't think past their insistent pull. The mark on his chest flared with heat, the pain sharp and unrelenting. He clutched at it, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The ocean seemed alive, its dark waters writhing like a living thing. And in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing on the horizon. The figure wasn't human. Its form was tall and gaunt, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It didn't move, but Darren felt its presence like a weight pressing against his soul. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Why can't you leave me alone?" The figure tilted its head, and the whispers ceased for a brief moment. The world was silent. Then the figure raised an arm, pointing toward the ocean. "Go," it said, its voice a deep, resonant echo. They need you. Darren hesitated. They need you. Darren hesitated, fear clawing at his chest. But the mark pulsed again, urging him forward. Gritting his teeth, he took a step toward the water. Ethan. The convergence, Ethan felt the threads pulling tighter. Their movements aligned now as Maeve, Elias, and Darren drew closer to the ocean. Their fear and determination rippled through the balance, strengthening it, even as the void's chaos threatened to unravel everything. The darkness was closing in, its tendrils slithering through the cracks in the edge. Seal! Ethan could feel its hunger, its desire to consume the convergence before it could complete. He reached out through the balance, his presence brushing against the minds of the three. Hold on, he told them. You're almost there. But the darkness felt his interference. Its tendrils lashed out, cutting through the threads and sowing chaos in their minds. Maeve stumbled, her resolve wavering as the whispers twisted into screams. Elias clutched the tablet, his vision blurring as shadows danced across the deck of the boat. Darren fell to his knees, the mark on his chest burning as the figure on the horizon dissolved into mist. Ethan gritted his teeth, his presence flickering as the darkness pressed against him. He couldn't let it win. He couldn't let the threads break. The first collision, the storm reached its peak. As the three converged, Maeve stood on the shoreline, her small form illuminated by the mark's glow. Elias's boat approached the coast. It's the Iron part the sort of keep very well top pointy airs brodersea. Hernis Provis that hull battered but still afloat. Darren stumbled onto the beach, his eyes wide as he saw Maeve standing there. For a moment, the chaos stilled, the ocean calmed, the whispers silenced. The three stared at each other, connected by the marks on their chests and the pull of the balance. And then the darkness struck. It rose from the ocean in a towering wave, a mass of shadow and tendrils that blotted out the moonlight. Its form was immense and ever-shifting, its presence suffocating. The marks on their chests flared brightly, their light pushing back against the encroaching void. Maeve screamed as the tendrils lashed toward her, but Elias leapt from the boat, the tablet in his hands glowing like a beacon. Darren threw in like a beacon, himself in front of Maeve, the mark on his chest pulsing with raw energy as the tendrils struck. The marks connected, their light merging into a single beam that pierced the darkness. The shadow recoiled, its form writhing as the light tore through it. Ethan's presence surged through the balance, his voice resonating in their minds. You're stronger together. Hold on. The light intensified, pushing the darkness back toward the ocean. But it wasn't retreating, it was regrouping, preparing for another strike. And this time, it wouldn't hold back. The darkness unleashed, the towering shadow writhed, its tendril writhed, its tendril pulling back only to surge forward with renewed force. The sky above churned with unnatural clouds, dark and swirling, as the darkness began to extend its reach across the beach. The light from the marks on Maeve, Elias, and Darren flared on Maeve, Elias, and Darren flared brighter, their connection strengthening. But the darkness was relentless. Ethan felt their struggle through the balance, their fear pressing against the threads that bound them together. He reached out, his voice resonating in their minds. You are not alone. Together, you can push it back. Maeve stood frozen, her small hands gripping Darren's jacket as he shielded her from the encroaching void. What is it? She whispered, her voice trembling. Why is it coming after us? Darren turned his head slightly, his expression grim. I don't know, he admitted, but I think it's afraid of us. Elias stumbled onto the sand, the glowing tablet in his hands radiating heat as it pulsed with the same rhythm as their marks. His eyes darted between the swirling mass of shadow and the symbols on the screen. It's feeding on the cracks in the balance, he said. his voice urgent. If it breaks through completely, we can't let it, Darren interrupted, his voice firm. What do we do? Ethan's voice cut through their fear. Stand together. The light of the marks is stronger than it knows. The light within Maeve stepped forward, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she looked at the looming darkness. The mark on her chest pulsed in time with the light from Elias's tablet and Darren's glowing mark. Her small hands balled into fists as she stared into the void. We're not going to let it win, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Right? Darren nodded, planting his feet in the sand. Right! Elias glanced at the tablet, the symbols shifting faster now, forming intricate patterns that seemed to mirror the light of their marks. If we combine the energy of the marks, he said, we might be able to drive it back. Maybe even seal the cracks. But how? Darren asked. Ethan's voice answered. The marks are connected to the balance. Focus your energy. Let the light guide you. Maeve took a deep breath, her small hands clutching at her glowing chest. Okay, she said softly. He'll try. First, strike. The darkness surged forward, its tendrils lashing out with a deafening roar. Darren stepped in front of Maeve, his mark flaring brightly as a tendril struck him. The impact sent him stumbling back, but the light held, pushing the steering wheel as sorry beat hard for a tepid top theory. Shadow away. Elias raised the tablet, its glow intensifying as he shouted, Together! Focus on the light! Maeve closed her eyes, her hands pressed to her chest as she concentrated. The mark's glow spread outward, forming a faint barrier that pulsed in rhythm with the balance. Darren and Elias did the same, their marks merging with Maeve's light, until the three were surrounded by a brilliant halo. The darkness recoiled, its tendrils writhing as the light pushed against it. But the void's hunger was insatiable. It surged again, this time splitting into multiple streams that surrounded it. The trio, hold on, Ethan's voice echoed in their minds. Don't let it break you. Maeve gritted her teeth, her small frame trembling under the pressure. We can do this, she said through clenched teeth. I know we can. Ethan sacrificed within the balance. Ethan felt the strain as the darkness pressed harder, testing this over the ties. It's your Maeve we carry, limits of their combined strength. The threads connecting Maeve, Elias, and Darren were strong, but they weren't enough to close the cracks. Ethan made a decision. He focused his energy, drawing on the light of the seal to amplify their seal, to amplify their connection. His presence surged through the balance, binding their marks together into a single, blinding force. The strain was immense, his essence flickering as the seal wavered under the effort. You're stronger than you think, Ethan told them, his voice steady despite the pain. I'll hold the seal, you focus on driving it back. The light of the marks flared brighter, their combined energy forming a wave that surged outward, striking the darkness head on. The void screamed, its form fracturing as the light tore through it. Ethan's presence flickered, the strain of holding the seal pushing him to his limits. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The void retreats, the darkness faltered, its tendrils withdrawing as the light overwhelmed it. The sky began to clear, the churning clouds dissolving into the night. The marks on Maeve, Elias, and Darren dimmed slightly, their glow steady but less intense. The void's form wavered, shrinking as it retreated into the ocean. For a moment, the world was silent, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. The cracks in the balance remained, and the darkness wasn't gone. It had only been pushed back, its hunger temporarily sated. A new purpose. Maeve, Elias, and Darren stood on the beach, their breathing ragged as they stared at the calm waters. The marks on their chests still glowed faintly, a reminder of the battle they had just fought. "What now?" Maeve asked, her voice small. Elias looked at the tablet in his hands, the symbols shifting slowly into a new pattern. "We stop it from coming back," he said. "Whatever it takes." Darren nodded, his jaw set. "We're in this together." Ethan's voice resonated softly in their minds. "You are the balance now. Protect it, strengthen it, and never forget you're not alone." The trio exchanged determined glances, their fear replaced by a growing sense of purpose. They didn't fully understand the battle ahead, but they knew one thing. The balance depended on them, and the darkness would return. The water lapped gently at the shore, the calm deceptive after the chaos they had just endured. Maeve stood between Elias and the eyes. Darren, her small hand resting over the mark on her chest. The glow had dimmed, but its warmth remained, steady and reassuring. She looked up at Darren, her voice quiet but certain. "It's not over, is it?" Darren shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the darkness had disappeared. "No," he said. "It's not." Elias knelt on the sand, the glowing tablet resting on his knees. The symbols were shifting again, their patterns forming, lines and shapes that almost resembled a map. He ran his fingers over the tablet's surface, his expression grim. The void wasn't defeated. It was pushed back, but it's still there, and those cracks. He looked up at the others. "They're still open." Maeve bit her lip, her fingers tracing the edge of the seashell she had brought with her. "The cracks," she whispered. "That's where it was coming from. It's trying to get through, isn't it?" Elias nodded. "And if it does, there won't be anything left to stop it." Darren turned to face them, his jaw set. "Then we need to stop it before it can try again." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their responsibility settling over them like a shroud. Maeve's gaze drifted back to the ocean, her eyes narrowing as she thought of Ethan's voice, the calm strength it had given her when the darkness had seemed overwhelming. "We're not alone," she said suddenly. "He's still with us, Ethan. He's part of this now, isn't he?" Elias exchanged a glance with Darren, then nodded. "He's the seal," he said. "The reason the void hasn't broken through completely, but he can't hold it forever. That's why we're here." Darren exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what's the plan? Because I'm guessing none of us signed up for a fight in ancient darkness when we woke up this morning." Elias stood, the tablet glowing brighter in his hands. The marks, the tablet, all of this, it's connected. There has to be a way to stabilize the cracks, to close them for good, but we're going to need to work together. Maeve tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "The light," she said. "When we stood together, the marks got stronger. It didn't like that. It was scared of us." Elias nodded. "The marks are part of the balance. They're tied to the seal. If we can harness their power, we might be able to strengthen the balance enough to keep the void from trying again." Darren crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Might? It's the best shot we have," Elias said. "Unless you have a better idea?" Darren sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Fine. So where do we start?" The tablet pulsed in Elias's hands, its glow casting strange patterns on the sand. "The tablet is leading us somewhere," he said. "The map keeps changing, but the symbols are pointing toward a specific location. If we follow it, we might find what we need." Maeve's eyes lit up with determination. "Then let's go." Darren hesitated, glancing at the ocean. "What if it comes back? What if we don't make it?" Ethan's voice resonated softly in their minds, calm and steady. "You've already faced it once. You're stronger than you know. Together, you can hold the balance." Darren looked at Maeve and Elias, their faces lit by the faint glow of the arcs. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Let's finish this. The trio turned toward the path ahead, the weight of their mission heavy but shared. The ocean shimmered behind them, its calm surface betraying nothing of the chaos that had unfolded. But in the depths, the darkness stirred, its hunger growing. Ethan watched from the balance, his presence intertwined with the threads that bound them together. He could feel the void pressing against the seal, its tendrils probing against the seal, its tendrils probing for weakness. But he could also feel the strength in Maeve, Elias, and Darren, their light, their determination. The battle was far from over, but they were ready to face what lay ahead together. They would hold the balance together. They would hold the balance together. They would hold the balance, would fight. The waves lapped at the shore as the trio turned to the tablet in Elias's hands. The symbols glowed faintly now, forming what looked like a spiral, an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with life. Elias traced the lines with his thrice. Elias traced the lines with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's leading us inland, he said, pointing to the direction where the spiral seemed to center. The balance must extend beyond the ocean. Darren glanced back at the water, his expression dark. His expression dark. Don't like leaving the coast. What if it comes back here? Maeve, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her mark, looked between them. It won't, she said quietly. It's following us. I can feel it. Her words hung heavy in the air. Darren's shoulders tightened, but he nodded. Accepting theory, Telk's with Belcair's shoulders tightened, but he nodded. Accepting truth. The darkness wasn't retreating, it was regrouping, waiting for the next opportunity to strike, and they had to stay ahead of it. Elias adjusted the tablet's brightness, the symbols shimmering as they pointed toward the dense forest that topped the beach. We'll follow the map, he said. If the balance is tied to these marks, then whatever's at the center of this spiral might be the key to fixing the cracks. Maeve hesitated, her fingers brushing the glowing mark on her chest. Will it be enough? She asked softly. To stop it for good? Ethan's voice, steady and calm, echoed in their minds. The balance isn't just about stopping the darkness. It's about holding it at bay, keeping it from consuming everything. What you're doing, it matters. Maeve looked up, her expression firm. Then let's go. The path through the forest was slow and treacherous, the dense canopy above blocking out most of the moonlight. Darren took the lead, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, while Elias stayed close to me, clutched the seashell she had brought from the beach. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the forest itself was alive. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, twisting and writhing before vanishing into the underbrush. The marks on. Their chests glowed faintly, their light pushing back against the encroaching gloom. Does it feel thicker to anyone else? Darren muttered, his voice low. Like the air's trying to stop us? Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the tablet. The symbols on the screen were shifting more rapidly now, their patterns becoming more complex as they approached the spiral's center. It's the balance, he said. The cracks aren't just in the seal, they're everywhere. The closer we get, the more unstable it becomes. Maeve stopped suddenly, her eyes wide. Did you hear that? She whispered. The group froze, straining to hear over the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of night animals at first. There was nothing. Then, faintly, a low hum reached their ears, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It's the same sound from the chamber, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're close. As they pressed on, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The forest thinned, giving way too. The forest thinned, giving way too. A clearing bathed in faint, otherworldly light. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, covered in glowing symbols that pulsed in time with the marks on their chests. It's beautiful, Maeve breathed, stepping closer, but Darren held out an arm, stopping her. Wait, he said. Do you feel that? The air in the clearing was different, charged with energy, but also laced with something darker. The shadows at the edges of the forest seemed to ripple, their forms shifting unnaturally. The hum became a low growl, and the marks on their chests flared brightly. Ethan's voice came again, urgent this time. Be careful. The void is close. The shadows surged forward, coalescing into a massive form that loomed over the clearing. Its tendrils writhed, stretching toward the trio as death growl grew into a deafening roar. The marks on their chests burned hot, their light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Get to the structure, Elias shouted, grabbing Maeve's hand. It's the center of the balance. Darren stood his ground, his fists clenched as he faced the advancing shadow. Go, he yelled. I'll hold it off. Maeve hesitated, but Elias pulled her toward the glowing structure, the tablet in his hand guiding their way. The symbols on the stone flared brighter as they approached, their patterns shifting to form an intricate, glowing spiral. Darren, spiral, turned to face the shadow, the light of his mark blazing like a beacon. Come on, then, he muttered, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Let's see what you've got. Maeve and Elias reached the base of the structure, the light of the spiral illuminating their faces. The hum of the balance was almost deafening now, vibrating through their bodies as the symbols aligned. What do we do? Maeve asked, her voice trembling. Elias placed the tablet on the stone, its glow merging with the symbols. We finish what Ethan started, he said. We seal the cracks. The structure began to shift, its surface glowing brighter as the symbols moved like living things. The air around them crackled with energy, the light of the marks merging into a single blinding beam that shot toward the sky. The shadow roared, its form writhing as the light tore through it. Darren staggered back, his body trembling as the darkness lashed out in its final attempt to overwhelm them. Through the balance, Ethan's voice rang clear. You're almost there. Hold on. Maeve placed her hand on the structure, her small fingers tracing the glowing spiral. The light intensified, pushing back the shadow until it dissolved into the night. Darren collapsed to his knees, his mark dimming but still glowing faintly. The clearing fell silent, the hum fading as the symbols on. The hum fading as the symbols on. The structure settled into place. The cracks in the balance began to mend, their jagged edges smoothing as the light of the seal restored stability. Maeve turned to Elias, her voice quiet. Did we do it? Elias nodded, his expression weary but relieved. For now, he said, the seal is stronger, but the balance, it's always fragile. Darren joined them, his breathing heavy. So what happens now? Eve's voice came softly, a faint whisper in their minds. You've done well, but the balance is a living thing. It needs guardians, and you are its protectors now. The trio exchanged glances, their marks glowing softly as the weight of their responsibility settled over them. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. Together, they would hold the balance, and together, they would be ready for whatever came next. The clearing was quiet now, bathed in a faint, otherworldly glow. The towering structure stood motionless, its intricate symbols softly pulsating in rhythm with the marks on their chests. Maeve, Elias, and Darren sat near its base, their breaths heavy as the weight of their victory settled over them. For the first time since this began, Maeve felt a strange sense of peace. She looked at the structure, then at Elias and Darren. It's over, she said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and uncertainty. Elias shook his head. Not over, he said. The balance is stronger now, but Ethan's right. It's fragile. We've bought time, but that's all. Darren leaned back against the stone, His eyes closed as he caught his breath. So we're stuck with this forever, huh? Guardians of the Balance sounds exhausting. Maeve gave him a small smile. You make it sound like a bad thing. He opened one eye, looking at her. Kid, you just saw what we're up against. It's terrifying, but we stopped it, Maeve said, her confidence growing. We can stop it again. Ethan's voice resonated faintly in their minds, steady and calm. She's right. The void will always test the balance, but it can't break it as long as you stand together. The words that filled them with a quiet strength. Darren sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right. Guess I'm in this for the long haul. Elias stood, brushing sand from his hands. The tablet might have more answers. It shifted after the light sealed the cracks. If we can understand its patterns, we might be able to prevent new fractures from forming. Maeve's eyes lit up with curiosity. So, we can fix things before they even break. Possibly, Elias said, but it's not just about preventing cracks. It's about understanding the balance itself. Why it chose us. Why Ethan is tied to it. Maeve looked up at the sky, the stars shimmering faintly above the clearing. Maybe it didn't choose us, she said thoughtfully. Maybe we were already part of it. In the quiet that followed, Ethan watched through the balance, his presence intertwined with the light of the seal. He felt their hope, their growing understanding of the role they had been given. They were stronger now, connected not just by the marks, but by the shared purpose of protecting the worlds bound to the balance. But Ethan also felt something else, a faint ripple, distant but persistent, at the far edges of the void. The darkness wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, learning, and when it struck again, it would be more prepared. The balance had been restored, but it was never permanent. Ethan knew this. So did the void, Maeve. So did the void, Maeve. Elias and Darren were the first of many who would stand as guardians. Their story was only the beginning. The structure's glow dimmed slightly as the trio prepared to leave the clearing. Darren stretched, groaning. All right, genius, he said to Elias. Lead the way. If that tablet of yours has a map to the next disaster, I guess we better follow it. Elias chuckled, his fatigue evident. Let's just hope it gives us a little time to rest first. Maeve looked back at the structure. As they walked away, her hand resting over the mark on her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt ready to face it. With Elias and Darren by her side, and Ethan's guidance through the balance, she knew they could handle through the balance. She knew they could handle whatever came next. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs, and the balance held.